I'm Carl, your friendly cyberbroker leftover, and one of the co-hosts for today.
I'm Merk, your co-host for tonight, DJ and fellow DJ.
Hello, I'm Lolo, a Writers Room author and California-based born-again DJ. Before crypto, I worked as a startup operations manager, but today I have the distinct honor of competing for Twitter attention against prolifically viral pictures of Vitalik. Super pumped for that. And today's chapter is one of my favorites. I'm in the presence of some CB super fans, excited to talk TPL.
I'm Nick. I am also in the writer's room along with Lolo, and I am currently a relationship consultant as well as being Requiem's drifter representative. I am based out of what was once called Florida. I'm very excited. Chapter 5, I think, was a pivotal point, and I'm really excited to talk about it.
Great. So welcome to the fifth in a series of lore listening parties, an opportunity for those who are new to learn more about the lore or storyline that is the foundation of CyberBrokers. For the rest, it's an opportunity to catch up or re-enjoy the richness of the lore chapters. And for each event, we have special guest hosts who are going to provide commentary, background, or their own personal experiences for what we're covering. Tonight, it's the first time we've had people from the writer's room, so I'm sure we're going to talk about that. After the chapter is done playing, we'll switch into community mode where people can come up and ask questions or share their own personal thoughts about this particular chapter. While we're listening, you can also post questions in CB General in Discord. I'm happy to read those for those who are uncomfortable coming up and speaking live. At the very end, there'll be some quick announcements and instructions on how to get entered into the giveaway. You can find past recordings on Twitter for a couple weeks and permanently now on the CyberBrokers YouTube channel. Okay, all that's out of the way. Tonight, we're going back to chapter 5. This was the first chapter where it was released in two parts. Part 1 was released on May 13th as quest number 2 was announced. There are actually 3 separate endings created for this chapter, or maybe I should say paths. Team Soul completed the most tasks and their ending was picked. Part 2 of the chapter was released at the end of quest number 2 on May 16th. So our special guests tonight are from the writer's room. Lolo and Nick, can you tell us more about how that works?
Yeah, happy to. I saw a post in the Discord early on about the creation of a writer's room, and sort of spam ping reacted, tagged Chris and Dot, and after that it was pretty easy. Just signed a blood oath NDA that Memnock said was totally standard Web3 practice, and we were off. It started as a place to share ideas and get feedback on fanfic pieces, really, that we were independently working on, and that quickly morphed into a massive creation center for all things CyberBrokers, from official chapters, quests, newspapers, broadcasts, lots of different mediums, lots of different breakout rooms to discuss everything from the history to the locations to the naming and describing of mech pieces and Asherah's keys. One of the cool things about it is it was really organic and fast. It was built together by a group of people who many didn't know each other beyond the cyberbroker universe, and decided collectively on different platforms for coordinating, editing, writing, producing, and dividing priority concerns. And so it was a really small, fun, collaborative group at first that has now turned into this giant machine of content creation that is really cool to see, and honestly moves so fast it's hard to keep up. The other thing I will say is that everything good comes at a cost, and the fear of spoilers is crushing. I'm terrified that I will leak something, but we'll burn that bridge when we get to it.
I am also terrified that one day I will be the cause of the leak, and then, according to the blood oath, I'm required to bathe in a volcano. But like I said, we'll burn that bridge when we get there. But yeah, I'm also in the writer's room. I want to say I was among maybe the first 10 in there. And we've had some growing pains. I won't say we haven't, but overall it's become a very vast and efficient creative system. And it's not always fun, but I think we all enjoy what we're doing, even when we're slogging through some stuff.
Yeah, so it's got to be interesting to, well, first have that blood oath, but the ramifications that as quests are occurring, you kind of know what's happening and have to keep your mouth shut a little bit, right?
It depends on the quest. Sometimes we have to stay out of it completely because we know too much, and sometimes you can still drift around because you don't know X, Y, or Z. Or if you know Y, you don't know why Z is happening. Stuff like that.
Yeah, it is this weird spot where you have some access to spoilers and advanced information, but not all of it. And this comes up in funny ways at our regular meetings where Chris and Brianna and others that are on the official team and have even more information than we do are trying to talk around it in the same ways that we are here. So it's an issue that everyone behind the creative process has to deal with. But I think the room itself is such a fun place where there's no risk of sharing an idea that is going to get dismissed quickly or not thought of. I mean, it might get memed into disappearing, but it won't be ignored. And I think that's a really fun place to work.
So I've seen a number of questions on this, and I'll provide a more specific answer. But how do you get into the writer's room now? And I think the answer I heard was, basically start creating, on Twitter, and take any cyberbroker character and start writing stories about it. And that's kind of the audition that will be looked at for future entry into the writer's room.
I want to say that's a pretty fair assessment. There's also some personal referrals, but that's very rare. And we've seen that the big thing we're trying to avoid is getting so many people in there who just want to get in on the, what do the crypto kids call it, alpha, rather than actually do stuff we need to do. That hasn't been a huge problem. Like, I don't want to make it sound like it is, but it's one thing we want to prevent. So it's less gatekeeping and more bringing people with passion on, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, totally. And people are certainly welcome to get creative in terms of their approaches to getting in. If they don't want to write a full backstory for their broker, perhaps they write some Onion-esque parody article or something that grabs attention or just sort of demonstrates a shared interest and values that we have here.
Cool, thanks. Let's come back to the lore a little bit before we start the chapter podcast. So, brokers are AI, the bombshell, then the writer's room starts and you have input. So how did the writer's room deal with the fact that they got handed that outcome?
You want to talk about something that's been causing us, I don't want to call it tension, but a lot of frustration is the wrong word. It's like the best kind of frustration, if that makes any sense. I don't know a positive word for frustration, but if I had it, I would use it here.
Yeah, I think there's probably more existential dread amongst the writers than the characters at this point in the story. I mean, we'll find out more as we listen today and see some of the reactions, but it definitely was and still is a sort of mind-blowing moment, and it opens up so many possibilities for histories and alternate histories of the broker universe, which I think is really cool.
Like, we rarely argue, but the whole AI thing, like, that caused probably some of the most intense debates, and some of them are still going on to this very moment.
Yeah, definitely. And they're like some of the timeless sort of cyber debates in the space, right? In terms of AI and enhancement and what that will mean for understanding what personhood is. And so for these things to be dropped so early into the chapters, right? It's just like people did not really get very long to relax and sit with the world before it seemed to get a bomb dropped on it, which is something that I think part of the writer's room frustration and feeling there is it's kind of scary, right? Because it's like, well, now we have to deal with this. There's going to be a lot of questions, and there has to be something that follows it, and we have to figure out which of those threads that we want to dedicate our energy to following and to writing, even though we have the sort of special benefit of being able to follow multiple and write some of those extra potential endings and paths that are real, like, super cool choose your own adventure for quest participants.
Okay, so we left off with Spice and Ken finding out that all brokers got their source code from Asherah and that brokers are AI. Spice logs out of the TPL and we're all left with our jaws on the ground. So is there anything you guys want to talk about in setup for Chapter 5 before we start it?
On my end, not really. It's kind of one of the chapters that you don't have to go in blind, but the less you know about it, the more, how do I say this? It's impactful whether or not you know it's coming, but the less you know, the more questions it raises. And I think that's one of the great things about the plot so far.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into it.
Okay. Merc, let's play the first part of Chapter 5 podcast.
CyberBrokers, how a paradigm shift became the paradigm lost. Project Paradigm, Chapter 5. 55% of every self-psychophysiotherapy users report finding the solution to their problems after one session. The ad buddy's soft, motherly voice had followed Spice downtown for 15 blocks through dark alleyways and empty streets. She frowned, hooded head down, and she quickened her pace. Typically, ad buddies were fun to be around, sometimes the life of a party, as they maximized positive feelings around their services and products. But when they separated a mark from the crowds, the friendly face often turned predatory. This one had probably caught an ill-timed upward glance and detected the micro-gestures indicative of stress, making her a prime target for the psycho-babble push. Her frown deepened. They'd been simply floating billboards in the beginning, a nuisance almost everyone ignored. But somehow their evolution to these newer, humanesque forms with those cutesy expressions had made them an almost acceptable annoyance. "I don't normally do this," it droned on behind her, "but I want to help. You seem like a nice person, and you deserve a gift. I'd love to give you a free K block of unrestricted access to a Metastone massage sound. Doesn't that sound amazing right now? Don't you deserve to let the mystical power of rare stones sweep all your worries away? Offer subject to an extensive wallet check and financialization of details by third-party liability for seized funds lies with the user. Full subscription at a variable rate required." Of course it does. Telling it no sounded easy, but she was biding her time. Not only did she not want to give it a reason to push harder, but also because it acted as a free warning system in case any other demons tried to catch her off guard and alone. So she let it stay, continuing its droning as it followed her along another street. A noise caught her attention, and she glanced up from the asphalt. A couple broke through the darkness of the empty alleyway. The drifter traced a lanky, thin line beside the ample, impossible curves of a Kama, his arm wrapped across her back, fingers grasping her shoulder. Good thing, too, we'd have run right into Spice's obnoxious companion. Not that either of them noticed her, or the ad buddy as they did. No, his own hungry eyes were caught deep in the riptide of promises, swirling in the oceans of hers. The ad buddy gave them a cutesy blink and spun away from Spice to follow its new marks. No longer motherly, His voice now sounded like every guy's cool big brother. "This is it, bro," it half whispered in front of them. "You don't want to mess this up, right? She's a nice girl who likes nice things. I've got a voucher to Proto right here, just for you." Spice stopped to watch as the drifter hesitated, looking from the girl to the ad buddy. It slid in closer. "Come on, bro. Let me help you out. Save you the embarrassment. She's a special girl, right? Your girl. Proto is the least you could do for her, don't you think? I mean, look at her. Tell me I'm wrong." One long glance sealed the deal. She smiled, and he accessed his firmware key without looking away. The human psyche is just as vulnerable to exploits as AI. Interesting. She shrugged and moved away from the transaction. Without her floating alarm bell, the quiet cobblestone road with its hidden entrances and private spots perfect for lovers and criminals was no longer safe. She moved towards the noise of Canada Street, still turning feelings over in her mind, as if her anxiety and worries were some cryptographic puzzle she could solve. Soon, Spice found herself on a graffitied walkway, crossing over 6 lanes of busy traffic. She stopped to lean over the railing and absorb the sights below. Multi-person transports and hoverbikes sliced the night into 2 columns of light, one red, one white, as crowds gathered and broke apart outside theaters, electronic booth stands, and clubs along the curb. Above them all, in a 10-story high-res hologrammatic, her camera posed and pouted, her human curves and colors reflecting against the hard glass and straight lines of the skyscrapers. A few seconds later, the tantalizing image blipped from view, replaced by an imposing flash spot logo. Spice closed her eyes, taking in the ambient sounds around her. In the distance, the distinct sound of an older model mech's jump boosters rumbled to life amid the crowd's laughter, the chaotic babbling of competing ad buddies. In the mix, a classic car alarm echoed from a vendor's bracer, followed by a random gunshot and the buzz of casual conversation, occasionally clipped by heated arguments. And all of it played along the thumping bass spilling from the club's now open doors. The sound of a real city. The sound of life. It felt real. She opened her eyes in response. Like that merchant and their bad attempt at flirting with an oblivious mercenary during an awkward exchange beneath the tumbling neon of a casino advert. Even the dazed contentment of the degens walking into a club, or the voices behind her on the walkway muttering complaints about a bracer brand. It all felt so. She stopped before the words spilled out of her brain again. Compared to their actual reality with its drab walls and incessant snow, life in the paradigm lost offered something beyond the misery of grinding work, or the inane satisfaction of a brief moment away from the monotony of seemingly endless cycles. Inside, it was full of action and complexity, color and life, opportunity and risk. In her periphery, a familiar gait drew her attention. Unironic Ken. She flicked down her hood and turned toward him. She'd almost forgotten that she'd pinged him right after she decided to plug back in. "How are you feeling?" At their last encounter, he'd been teary-eyed and shocked. Now, he seemed worn out. He shrugged. "Less confused, more angry. You?" She shook her head. "I'm still just..." She exhaled one long breath. "Confused. I'm sorry I left so suddenly last time. Forget about it." He glanced down. "There are bigger questions now, bigger than us, and I want answers." He kicked at the walkway. "It won't be easy." "Hey." She touched his arm, and he looked up at her. "Whatever it takes." He gave her a small smile. "I was thinking, we should probably..." Ken stopped mid-sentence, his eyes focusing over her shoulder. His expression hardened, and his mouth tightened into a thin line. She turned, already knowing. "Zinc." "Hi." The greeting held a lilt at the end, like he was surprised to see her with Ken. "Listen, there's something you should know. Something big we uncovered while looking for old grams of your mum." Beneath them, the rasp of a motorcycle cut through the hum of Canada Street, like a warning about what she wanted to say. Telling someone their entire existence was a lie warranted a better venue and more intimacy than the walkway, but time wasn't on their side. "Brokers aren't..." She bit back the word with a small unhappy noise, and a glance at Ken. He gave her a somber nod. Brokers aren't what, Spice? Might as well rip off the entire Band-Aid. Brokers aren't people. You aren't human. You're an AI. The whole body's in cryo at some secret government facility. It's all a lie. They were never going to send you back because there isn't a body to go back to. There never was. She ran a hand up her arm. You're a program, Zinc. That's what I'm trying to tell you. He opened his mouth in wordless motion, eyes bouncing between them, like he wasn't sure if they were joking or just crazy. Turning, he grabbed the railing with both hands as he steadied himself under the weight of her words. He clenched his jaw and the muscles in his neck tensed beneath his skin like ropes of steel. She stepped towards him, but Ken caught her arm and shook his head. She pulled against his grasp until he let go, but she didn't move any closer, half expecting Zinc to scream or punch the rail, or worse, throw himself over the bridge. Instead, he turned back to her with a sigh and shrugged. So? Spice took a step back. What do you mean, so? He shrugged again. Does it really matter? Ken opened his mouth, then shook his head and turned away from them both. Do you understand what I just told you? Zinc nodded and released the rail, wiping his palms down his pant legs. I mean, come on, it's been 200 years, no news, no developments. Hell, they stopped mentioning the return a while ago. I gave up, 2 lifetimes ago, gave up waiting. A lot of us have. I mean, once you start to realize that the paradigm returned is vaporware anyway, finding out you're actually an AI doesn't make such a big difference. You're insane, Ken growled. He stared hard at Spice. You really know how to pick 'em, don't you? Sounds like you're not taking it very well, Zinc shot back. Ken stalked towards him. Of course I'm not. Why? I don't feel any less of a person than a block ago. Zinc turned to Spice. Do I seem less of a person now that you know I'm an AI? She stepped between them. Of course not, but don't you care? About what? She threw her hands up, exasperated. I don't know, about who made you or why, or maybe where your programming comes from. Amusement washed over Zinc's face. Do you? Really? Does it matter? Great, Ken muttered. Your boyfriend was programmed a philosopher. Or maybe the problem is that you don't actually get irony. Zinc eyed Ken over the top of her head, thickening the tension. Both men stiffened on either side of her, stances shifting wide, hands clenched tight into fists. Well, hell. She laid both palms against Zinc's chest and drew his gaze to hers. With gentle force, she pushed him back. It's a lot. He wrapped his hands over hers and pushed her away. It's really not. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Fine, whatever, but could you please help us? With what? The words came out in a chuckle. Getting the message out. Zinc looked out over the walkway, a hand buried in his hair. He gestured at Canada Street with a flourish of his hand. To them? Spice followed the line of his arm to the street below. An Alpha Command pilot chased a scrawny, laughing tripper until she tackled him hard to the ground and began searching his person. The tripper's continued laughter brought grins to the audience of bored drifters nearby. Seriously, Spice, to who? Half the brokers in the metaverse already suspect something is wrong, and this won't alleviate that suspicion. You think the degens or sheep will go around contemplating their existence? Humans? AI? The genetically modified, neurologically augmented cat-cammer hybrids? Do you think any of them care? Do you really believe that this, he ran a hand over the lower half of his face, nugget you've uncovered is going to make any difference? No one will care, because all of them still need to make rent. And what about the other half? Ken demanded. Zinc shrugged. What about them? Come on. Maybe ignorance is their bliss. The best gift we could give them. Better than being rug pulled or having their minds blown. Who knows how they'll react when you let them know, as he curled his fingers into air quotes. How do you plan on dealing with what comes after? Because if they care, there's no telling how they're going to react. If you're lucky, they'll just be angry or violent. They have a right to be, Ken interrupted, with a note of purpose Spice hadn't heard before. No one is saying they don't. Zinc leaned his elbows on the rail and rested his forehead against his fingertips. What do you do when they get suicidal? Anything in your white knight programming for that? Ken blinked, and the color drained from his face. I don't know. I didn't think so. Zinc pushed off the rail and let out a long, low whistle before leaning back, elbows on the railing. He lowered his head and gave her a look, one she recognized from the mech races, the one barely holding back a smile. She stepped closer. What? He fanned his arm wide. This is one hell of a second date. Spice laughed aloud despite herself and the seriousness of the situation. To her left, she felt Ken's glare, but she ignored it. Told you I was amazing. Zink finally unleashed the smile and then pushed himself upright. He nodded, and all traces of the earlier tension evaporated. Grinning at the other two. So, do we have a plan?
Okay. we get our first experience of an ad buddy, more details about Iranovum. The love triangle somehow meets in the middle of the city. Zink is told he's AI, but doesn't seem to care. Ken's all amped up about the revelation, and the three are trying to decide what to do. And my favorite line in there, maybe you don't get irony. That was just killer. So how did the writer's room decide, this was going to be the start of the chapter with, kind of Spice walking around and running into these two?
Well, the cliffhanger was quite concerning, seeing Spice Rugg pull herself out of there and leave both of our main characters in crisis. We knew we needed to deal with the aftermath in a way that made sense for each of the different characters, starting with Spice, who's had her playful belief shattered and clearly at the start of this chapter lost a bit of her alpha command Chad energy. We've got Ken unwaveringly unironic and purpose driven, even if more by romantic attraction than existential dread. And we've got Zink, who all we really get out of is a muscular twitch as his code just kind of gulps down any hint of worry or self-doubt, still cynical and there for some levity and comic relief. And to Carl's point on favorite line for the chapter, anything in your White Knight programming for that really gets me. And so while the writer's room might be in agreement on like the setting, like we knew we needed to get these characters, together and interacting, there's still going to be like lines in the sand and knives out to defend Team Ken and Team Zink, just like they were fighting in general and all over Twitter at this point. But regardless, it's infinitely fun to help create those moments that makes the characters who they are. And also the ad buddy, I think, is an unsung hero for the introduction of this chapter, and Supermassive's accents are just absolutely choice.
I'm glad you touched on the ad buddy. I know it was not the most significant part of part one, but just the characterization of what an ad buddy is and how gently they are with the force of their advertising. It was a great characterization, and that really gave the world a bigger and more organic feeling before we jumped into our main plot. And what I liked about it is, yes, there's this big revelation and all that jazz, but you still have Zink and Ken bickering and making snaps at each other, and that's what I've seen in real people. Even if something major is going on, unless you're a meat dying right in that moment, people are still going to be petty about petty stuff. So I really like that characterization of the love triangle.
So the last part there was actually quite interesting because it was an argument over should you do anything or not. And there's kind of, no single answer as they portrayed that, there's pros and cons of each. Was the setting already done that this was going to get addressed versus ignore it? Or is that something that kind of came about through the writer's room?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it came up and we decided that sort of the inhabitants of the universe would decide it themselves in a way, right? Like, and that happens in this chapter. And when you see the different reactions from Ken, Zink, and Spice, and that would spiral throughout the rest of the brokers and drifters of the world, and that many of them, for one reason or another, wouldn't care, even if they were told, and others might agonize over whether they should be told or not in the first place. So yeah, I totally think that's right on, Carl, in terms of what really draws me into this chapter is that, yes, there's all this stuff going on with Spice, Zink, and Ken, and with the brokers and AI, but it feels like most of these things could also be taking place now, 200 years in the past.
You know, it is a tricky question about when they were arguing, should they reveal it to people or not? And the big thing there is Ken and Zinc, you know, they're the first ones with this information that are directly affected by it because they're the first brokers that we know. And they're just, I don't want to say numb, but they really don't know how to take it. And when you get big revelations like this, it's one of those things that it rarely hits you in the moment. So I think it's perfectly fine that they're not having their breakdowns right there and then, because it's still all fresh. They haven't had time to process it.
Interesting. So one last question about the writer's room. Sorry, just so interested in it since not in it. Like those one-liners, are those one-liners like, you know, guess you don't get irony. Are those coming like from the writer's room, or is that something the writer adds?
Ooh, yeah. I think a lot of them are Johnny's originals, and when they're shared in the room for feedback or whatnot, maybe it's a little of both, in that these suggestions are often like, okay, you've said something here in this paragraph. Here's like a really, snarky way of saying it, or here's how we think Zinc would say this instead. And that sort of feedback, I think, often really comes from Mags and a lot of the other folks that were in early and devouring the lore and reading these early chapters over and over and over again in a way that like equips them to help give input on future chapters in a special way, because they know perhaps more about some of these characters than the creators. Yeah.
And I fully agree with that. It's really a case-by-case ad hoc basis. Sometimes the writer's room touches more than some chapters more than others. But I have found, like with Dot and with Mags, like they're really good at taking a sentence that just gets the point across and then turns it into something sharp and snappy and really fits for the character. And that's something I can't do. I'm fairly blunt, and bluntness will of course lack sharpness, and I think sharpness is important with a character like Spice because she's a Alpha Command officer, and they don't let anyone become an officer from what we've seen in the lore.
And it's interesting that you mentioned Ken versus Zinc, because from my perspective, I didn't get that Team Ken versus Team Zinc thing until the vote occurred. But what I'm hearing from you is Team Ken versus Zinc might have been occurring in the writer's room before that.
Oh, definitely. People are choosing sides, and it's in the one hand, it's because there's a love triangle, and you should, but also because they have very distinct traits and values early on, right? They're very different people, especially the like. I was really against Zinc in the early days of his sort of unabashed confidence, and like just sort of thought like, what does Spice even see in this guy? But kind of over time, and in this reaction to the bombshell news, kind of the way he handled it, it's like such a good, consistently written character to provide such an important role for the rest of the story. That I've switched to Team Zinc.
Yeah, the real formalization of like Team Ken, Team Zinc came later, but each individual writer had their opinions on both characters. We did a fairly good job and still do a fairly good job of not letting our personal biases take over the narrative from the community. But there is a internal bias on each writer, and we're people, so that's to be expected. But while I like Zinc more than I used to, I still like Ken more. And I think the reason I don't like Zinc is because he got into a politician's crew as a what is his trade name? I apologize. It just
Cleanup crew.
Thoughtbird came, just took cleanup crew away from me. And how did a cleanup crew get on a politician's crew? Like, politicians have small circles at the upper level. So what is he up to? That's at least in my mind.
Oh, exactly. I mean, also as a shadow apologist, I think that these are some of the most interesting threads of the story. Is that like, you've got a lot of leftovers and not as many specific talent employed brokers and sort of the development of those stories. How did they get to the position they are now? And what, makes one cleanup crew member different from another one? What sort of messes do they clean up, and how do they determine whether they'll be involved in taking those jobs or not? I mean, there's just so much room there for some good stories. Yeah.
Not just our official stories. It gives the NFT holders so many ways they can take their story. I think being in a virtual world really helps with that on top of everything else. Because sure, there's the main paradigm rules that most places follow, but having a sub-realm or a sub-zone that does something else is not just possible, I would say it's encouraged, in my own opinion, of course.
Cool. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's great hearing what's going on behind the scenes. It clearly comes through in the writing, but you're having these conversations before we, the community, are many times. I want to move forward just so we can get to the end of the chapter and bring people up for questions. So Merc, if you could start the second half of chapter 5 for us.
Protests, Ken said. We march on the Merkle tree, a show of strength and numbers so the founders know they can't hide any longer and that we demand the truth. Spice took a second to appreciate Ken's righteousness, then frowned and said, the metaverse hadn't seen dissent in a long time. They might make an example of us to make sure it doesn't for a long time again. Organizing won't be easy too. You got a better idea? A script kitty I busted a few K blocks back gave me a lead on a group of brokers using the Power 11 employee network to hack the Paradigm Broadcasting Corporation advertising servers. All they needed was somebody to manipulate a physical failsafe stored on the 57th floor of the PBC building. If we can break in, we'd be able to send a message across the metaverse. Every ad buddy, bracer, billboard, and restaurant menu will broadcast the truth. Zinc let out a doubtful sigh. That building's pretty well protected, and how do you even know this group is legit, or that the failsafe hasn't been secured since you heard about it? Listen, you guys need to use your brains a little. It's one thing to get the message out. It's another thing to have the power to do something about it. You need a politician on your side, and you need to speak the only language they understand. Right, Ken said. Protest. Wrong, Zinc replied. Blackmail. I can get you a meeting with Altair. I can also tell you that he's not only worried about the AI vote, but about the DAO itself. He's losing out to his rivals. If you can convince him to take your side on this, and that if he doesn't, you'll go to one of his rivals, he'll help you get the message out, and more. Sure, Ken snorted. Let's just trust a politician. That's never gone wrong before. Zinc shrugged, and for a few moments they all stood there, thinking it over. Spice, Ken said eventually. It's your call. Long moments crawled by until, finally, Spice folded her arms across her chest. You're right, Ken. It's time to organize. Zinc was wrong. Brokers did care. The drifters too. Words spread fast and unrelenting. First through the underbelly of the strip, away from authoritarian eyes, then beyond into the games and villages. Building from whispers and discreet nods of camaraderie into opinionated rants and angry slogans until it was too late for anybody to stop. Some believed, some didn't, but everyone wanted to do something. All their deep feelings of having been lied to, of being given a rough deal, of the paradigm being twisted into something they didn't like was ignited. A fire that grew until it manifested into bodies, boots on the streets of the strip, shouts that grew louder as the numbers grew. A lot of people weren't even satisfied with just protest. They wanted revolution. Mechs and vehicles showing support by flying above, Ken and Spice at the head of the wave. Eventually, the Merkle tree was in view. The gigantic skyscraper around which gnarled cables carried power in the form of information. Smooth, curved walkways and hovercar launchers sprouting from the central structure, dotted with viewing platforms in an architectural feat as absurd and pompous as shows of power usually are. More than that, lines of still, well-organized samurai had sentryed in front of the tree, blocking the route-like entrance. Their well-maintained mechs and vehicles arranged as menacingly behind them. When she saw them, Spice felt hesitant for a moment. This was bigger than her and her friends now. The protesters behind her were passionate and unstoppable. She glanced at Ken, who screamed fury like he was the head of this giant dragon. Onwards, at the samurai, they marched. There was no going back now. The brokers had risen.
Okay. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, request to come up, or post in CB General and Discord. Happy to entertain people's questions. So, Hacking Paradigm Broadcasting Corporation, to get the news out, the brokers are AI. That was all about the quest that happened, marching in protest to the Merkle Tree, samurai blocking their path, and again, a little bit of another cliffhanger, something we weren't used to in the first few chapters. Maybe we should process this ending before I ask the other question. But so how did we get to they're going to go to the Merkle Tree and protest?
Sorry, Twitter was being weird. I'm not going to pretend I remember every phase of the protest quest in and of itself, but how we ended up there, it was pretty close if I remember right. I want to say that right behind it was the politician angle. But we had a lot of fun designing what would happen on those three different outcomes. Like, it was some of the most active I've ever seen the writer's room go at one individual object. And the amount of stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor that was still great is also pretty high. Not to say what came out wasn't great. It's just everyone had a lot of great ideas about how we wanted to play that.
So maybe a more specific question with that. So it was team mind versus team body versus team soul. And team soul won. And so this is the ending we got. But how did the paths apply to mind, body, or soul, or did they?
Oh, right. Yeah. No, they definitely, well, we sort of felt like they lined up well in terms of like the soulful reaction is this, community engaged protest that is paradigm wide. And the other sort of like body option, right, might be sort of more physical or violent option. And then the mind option, right, could just be some sort of like behind closed doors backroom deal to get something done. Like, and the way that those traits were aligned, I think was really important. And we wanted to make sure that it wasn't a Sag, let's make a deal where behind door number 1 and 2, you get to start a really cool revolution, but behind door number 3, you're just stuck in traffic behind a behemoth mech on the freeway. And so, like, there was a long sort of process of making sure that each of the 3 options like passed the fun test, or like did Venus and Burke think that it was a sufficiently fun and engaging option, and then did folks like Brianna and Dot and Mags like align the different scenarios to make sure that they are lining up with the places, locations, and characters that we've made so far, and just making sure that all 3 of those options would be exciting paths for the community to take regardless. And yeah, I definitely agree that and the newspaper are probably 2 of the most like nonstop engaged writers room kind of days that we've had in the past few months. It's crazy that it's been almost 6 months, but yeah.
Yeah, but to go along with what Lolo was saying, like there were several important things, but we wanted each path to be fun. But I will want to say we also spent a lot of time trying to figure out what would a mind, body, and soul option look like. We didn't just we're just attaching a name to whatever action they're doing, and this is soul, even though it has nothing to do with soul, if that makes any sense. And a lot of stuff there was also put on the cutting room floor. But I'm pretty happy with how it all ended up, because nothing felt like shoehorned into that particular trait, in my opinion.
So I got a question from chat. This was also the first mention of Merkle Tree, and kind of Merkle Tree being the center of Era Novum. Was there any vision of what the Merkle Tree looked like?
There's always some vision in the writer's room. There's often some like hastily scribbled MS Paint, Photoshop, DALL-E, OpenEye hodgepodge of an idea that's sort of trying to help someone else in the room understand what you're saying, because the things we're talking about are so out there, right? Like the Merkle tree itself, and trying to like visualize what it would look like. And yeah, there was a long, extended discussion of folks laying out the sort of different ways that it could work architecturally, structurally, and then folks coming in and saying, why are you using these old methods of architecture and structure when we can break off all of those limits and think far more creatively? And then, a paragraph gets posted that's trying to like calm that down a bit and say, right, we don't want to get too crazy, and want to like limit it and make sure that the world makes sense still. So yeah, those conversations go on and are definitely some of the most interesting.
I completely forgot about that, but we did spend a lot of time trying to figure out that fine line between, okay, we're not constrained by conventional architecture and physics, but we also don't want to look like everything's operating off magic. And I think the Merkle tree ended up being a very beautiful example of walking that line well.
And I apologize, that question came from LoLoWGramz in Discord. My apologies for not stating that up front. So is there any, I don't know what to call them, rules is the wrong word, guidelines about, you're only going to describe certain things so much and stop because you want, the community itself to envision it, versus, fully describing something to the point where it's now set in stone and there's not a lot of interpretation left?
That's another one of those case by case things. It depends on how important it is to the plot or how much we're going to be exploring it in the long run. Like, we don't want to spend 4 paragraphs describing a coffee shop that the characters are never going to visit again. And we have a few rules, but most of our stuff is guidelines, trying to keep things consistent. Like, on my end, I always forget our units of time, so that's something I have posted all around me so I never lose it. And we want to keep that consistent. So it really just depends on, do we want to keep it consistent and how important is it to the plot?
That's hilarious that you mentioned that, because right before this space has started, I thought, someone might bring up something about time and I should review the cycles, seasons, circuits, etc. And so yeah, that's something that we often like. Everyone has probably a lot of big boards and maps and notes of things written down. I mean, I know, Carl, you're sort of like one of the originators of this, right? Like, before even the writer's room, you were sort of collecting all of this stuff and putting it on your own website and sharing it on Twitter with folks, and like are one of the originators of the community collaboration and building here. So, and that's just sort of how it took place, which is really cool.
That just reminded me of how much time we spent trying to figure out what to call the units of time. Like, I don't even think we're done setting that in stone yet.
No, and early on in the days of the writers' room, Chris kind of dumped a lot of stuff that he had been working on, and that was kind of like indexes and collections of both like the plans for some of the story loosely, and then also just like a lot of the terms and glossaries of information. And I can still revisit those to this day and be like, wow, I still, totally forgot about that. We had like a paragraph written on this already tucked away, and then we can sort of deploy it. And Brianna's done such a good job of like collecting all the resources. One of the early issues we had in the writer's room was just like keeping track of everything and making sure we didn't lose discussions or ideas. And we had them on all sorts of different places, right? Like in Discord and on Google Docs and on other clouds and stuff. And so we've been able to like streamline all that and bring it together. And now it's like a super fun way to share ideas or argue about stuff.
That's a good time for a shout out. Anna in Discord, or Ohas on Twitter, has a site called iranovum.xyz. And actually, he's been working on a TPL clock to try to help translate what has been said in the story versus our real time here. So make sure to check that out. So there were 3 endings and I'm getting, ending one is what we got, which was getting to, the Merkle tree and kind of a confrontation with the government, the samurais. Another option was go stealth about it. And then the third option was something more violent. So this meant that you only had 1 month to figure out what came from each of those and then get to the next step, right? So how did that work out?
It actually ended up, I think we had less than a month. I don't remember clearly, but I want to say we had less than a month, actually.
So good.
Yeah, no, it's hard to remember I think the process at that point was still being constructed. Like when the quests and the chapters are coming out there, that was still like some of the earlier days of the writer's room, maybe like the first month or so.
Had Lady Diamondtown come on board at that point? I want to say no.
Right, like even if they had, I don't think that they had time to like set up shop and wrangle all the cats yet. So it was still a bit ad hoc, but the quest team also like helped a lot and led a lot of those discussions for us, like having J-Tob in the writer's room to like help work out the way that we can navigate the like chapter lore with the quest and the participation is like super important, because obviously the 3 different options for what's going to happen are also going to affect the way that the entire experience goes. So it's not just like writing the chapters, but also developing it in a way that makes sense for the quest too.
Okay, just want to remind people, if they want to ask a question here live, just request. Happy to have you up, or post anything in CB General. So I want to talk about where we left off. So apparently Ken decides to go along with the other two and their decision to make it public. Everyone's heading towards the center of the town, and then there's conflict, and there's a samurai line. How did that path come up to be the ending and kind of cliffhanger for this particular chapter versus taking the story a little further? Sometimes I'm always curious on where you decide to make the breaks.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that a lot of that is often determined by Johnny, in sense of like, and they keep getting sort of longer and longer because there's so much information to pack in. But I think that, yeah, like sort of the limits, I think, is partially quest related, but also just sort of Johnny saying this is probably long enough for a chapter, and if we go any further, it's going to be way too long. So that's sort of like how the line gets drawn. And I do distinctly kind of like remember the brainstorming of what it would look like when they were marching on the Merkle tree, and what the opposition would look like, and that like samurai line being like sort of brought up and talked about. So yeah, it definitely felt epic, which is it's really cool.
The other thing I wanted to ask about was choices of different talents to bring in. So each of these chapters certainly has a main plot line, but at the same time, you're pulling in a little bit of the other lore with the talents and kind of helping position them. So we all kind of, if we looked at the samurai talent ahead of time, we kind of understood what they were, but we didn't really understand their position in the TPL or the CyberBrokers universe. Is some of that part of Writer's Room too, about who's on what sides?
Yeah, I would actually say that is a big part. Even now, we spend a lot of time talking about what each talent does in the particular world and how fenced in they are to their role. Samurai are actually one of the few traits where we can say these people are the politicians' most loyal people, because we haven't worked out the process of how samurai happened, but we know that each one is sworn to a politician. So it made perfect sense for them to be the last line of defense. But we're always talking about what talents do what and what else can they expand on them and how pigeonholed are they, stuff like that.
Yeah, totally. I think that it comes and goes both ways. Whereas we'll have a setting or an idea or a story that's going on, and someone will bring up a talent that has been left out. So, this would be a great spot to bring in a camera because we need someone that is gonna look a certain way or act a certain way, and that talent would help us there. But now that we have like sort of the broker auditions element where folks can try to get their broker into a specific role, that's a cool way of doing it. And and also it's I think important when we think about like bringing in the talents to sort of understand that the information that everybody has about them is very limited, right? We have the descriptions, and that's about it. And so folks have like put in a lot of and invested in a lot of ideas about what they think that talent might be. And so we don't just sort of like take full liberty to make the talents be whatever they want them to be, but it's just sort of like a really iterative process of thinking like, you know, what can a smuggler smuggle? What items is it limited to, and how does that work, right? Like, what are they smuggling? Bits of pieces of data and information, or like actual physical things and stuff like that. And so, I think that those conversations about what the talents can be still are happening and still to be decided. Like, so much of the universe and like what we would call like guidelines or rules haven't even been written yet, which is fun.
Thanks. I wanted to open up for either of you to share anything about this particular chapter or the writer's room that you thought was important that we haven't asked questions about, and then we can move into the announcements section and the giveaway.
I'm not gonna say it's my favorite chapter. I do enjoy it, but it's not my favorite. But what I do enjoy about it is the characterization of the world, but also showing how quickly things can change. Because as they were talking about early in the chapter, there hadn't been any unrest in living memory, from the way it made it sound. And next thing you know, the samurai, who probably have a pretty chill job most of the time, are standing in front of this vast horde of brokers and drifters and mechs in front of the seat of power. And I think that was a very powerful place to leave off.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And sometimes until we talk about it that way, the samurai probably have never been all together in one place like that before because they weren't needed like that.
I didn't think about that, but yeah, no, that would probably be the first time, if not ever, at least in a while.
Unless they have some secret, hangout somewhere. So maybe we could clarify that within public. Did they go to the Requiem Tower at all?
Requiem has a standing rule not to let known political lackeys into the tower. It's caused a lot of drama, but he refuses to rescind it.
So, Lolo, do you have a broker you speak through like Nick?
I have a smuggler named Graceful Crier that was the broker that I minted, and I have not fully made it a mouthpiece yet, but it is in development. Right, this was the project that I was working on before I joined the writers' room, with the idea of like sort of getting feedback on it and iterating it there, and have since been like taken with so many other things that it's in development. So probably will be housed in Requiem's Tower because it has no political affiliations, which is good.
Or as long as you don't have any other fishermen in your team, you're good. He doesn't like fishermen.
Fishermen don't like him.
Fair enough. So I think that's a good ending spot. Any other comments either of you'd like to make before we move into announcements and then the giveaway?
Oh, just thanks for having me, Carl. It was a blast. And yeah, let's give the people what they want. Some free stuff.
Yeah, I have to thank you for having me as well. This was much more fun than I thought it was going to be. And I already thought it was going to be pretty fun. So excellent. Thanks everyone for coming.
Yeah, and thank both of you for taking your time. I know these aren't always the easiest time frames, so I appreciate you making yourself available. And the community just loves hearing all these extra little details that come out. It just adds to some of their own thoughts, and frankly makes them think about things that maybe they didn't notice while they were reading it, which I think is kind of the whole point of all this. This was Chapter 5, Lore Listening Party. Chapter 6, Lore Listening Party, is this Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern, and that features Dot and Little from the Writers' Room as well. Each Thursday, 2 and 9 p.m., are community spaces. Merc and I hop on Twitter, talk about any topics. Tuesdays, 2 p.m. and 9 p.m. are creator calls, a place where anyone can come and bring ideas they have for the CyberBrokers universe. Find people to work with, get updates on projects, ask questions about the community fund. So Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 and 9 p.m., get those on your calendars. Special events like this will potentially take those spots moving forward. And then each week before Monday noon, make sure to check Discord calendar. That will have your list of events for this particular week. Nick, Lolo, can you pick a topic for like a minute while I set that up?
Yeah, totally. Let's talk about the merits of the Behemoth mech compared to the Lupus mech. I mean, I think that the Behemoth mech is, pretty niche in its utility. Like, it seems like it's gonna be like pretty hard to drive around, slow. Like, I don't see myself or brokers operating it very often. Whereas the Lupus, it just seems like it's gonna be great for lots of different options. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, you have to remember the Lupus mech requires a high degree of skill in order to get everything out of it. So I think that's a bit of a limiter on that.
I'm not worried about that. I'll just turn on the turbo boosters and drive it into a wall and then just replace the parts. I think, it's fine.
I guess if you have the budget for it, it's fine. But I'm actually a big fan of the Behemoth. I think it's underutilized. I think the TPL has been too stagnant for too long, and we need a new hotshot drifter pilot to come through and show the world what you can do with a Behemoth mech with Nexus legs.
Yeah. I mean, it's a bold take. The Behemoth, it's fallen out of the meta. I don't think that many are predicting a resurgence for it. If anything, it might just be a dead cat bounce for the Behemoth mech. But maybe someone can prove me wrong.
Well, with the way the paradigm is now, everything's up in the air. Everyone's trying new ideas. We got the fizzies that are operating an open black market. We got protest. Anything can happen.
That's true. We didn't even get to talking about overclocking the various Behemoth parts. But if Carl's ready for us, we can give him back the floor.
That was great filler. Thank you very much. That was awesome. I wanted to stop again and thank Merc, as always. Silent in the background, but making all this happen. Thank you, Merc. Thank you, Lolo, and thank you, Nick/Requiem/Venus and all other alts that you have for hopping on and sharing more with us. And I look forward to you all returning in future chapters to share more. Thank you all. Good night.
All right.